The sun was a merciless eye in a bleached white sky, searing the color from everything it touched. Below, the parched earth of the Arizona Territory cracked into a mosaic of baked clay and alkali dust. The skeletal remains of sagebrush clawed at the air, their branches brittle and gray, long since having surrendered to the heat. The only movement was the shimmering haze that danced above the horizon, distorting the distant, jagged mountains into watery phantoms. Cutting through this immense and silent emptiness was the train, a steel serpent breathing smoke and cinders. Its rhythmic clatter was a profane intrusion, the groan of its wheels a constant complaint against the miles of iron track laid across the indifferent land. Dust, fine as flour, billowed in its wake, a temporary ghost that settled back onto the landscape as soon as the last car had passed. Inside, the heat was a physical presence, thick with the smell of coal, hot metal, and the close, weary scent of too many bodies packed into too little space. Sunlight filtered through windows clouded with grime, fell in dusty shafts, illuminating the tired faces of prospectors with failed dreams in their eyes, farmers chasing rumors of fertile land, and families who had packed their entire lives into worn leather trunks. Eden moved through this world like a wraith. She had left her seat in the crowded passenger car an hour ago, unable to bear the weight of the gazes, the casual questions, the simple human connection that felt like a threat. Each friendly smile seemed to her a potential betrayal, each inquiry about her destination a trap. So she walked, her hand trailing along the swaying walls, her steps unsteady with the motion of the train and the tremor in her own limbs. She was a slight figure in a plain, high-collared dress of dark calico, a garment chosen for its ability to render her invisible. It was creased and dusty from a journey that had begun not with a ticket, but with a frantic climb out of a bedroom window 2 nights before. Her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, were raw where she had gripped the rough edge of a wagon bed for hours, her knuckles white and bloodless. Her hair, the color of autumn honey, was pulled back in a severe bun, but rebellious strands had escaped to cling to her damp neck and forehead. She looked younger than her 19 years, her face pale and drawn, her wide gray eyes holding the haunted, watchful look of a cornered animal. She passed through the dining car, where men in suits laughed loudly and drank whiskey, their voices booming in the enclosed space. She flinched from the sound, her gaze dropping to the floorboards as she hurried through. She passed through another passenger car, this one less crowded, where a mother hummed a lullaby to a sleeping child. The soft, gentle sound was a physical ache in Eden's chest, a reminder of a tenderness she had never known. Her own mother was a faded memory, a miniature portrait in a locket her father had long since sold. Her father. The thought of him was a cold knot in her stomach. It was his voice, his cold, calculating words, that had sent her fleeing into the desert. He had not shouted. He never did. He had spoken of it as a transaction, a simple matter of business. Mr. Albright was a man of considerable means, a rancher with thousands of acres and a face like a slab of granite. He was also 40 years her senior, with a reputation for a hard hand and a cold heart. But he had offered a handsome price, enough to clear her father's gambling debts and secure his failing mercantile business. "It is a good match, Eden," her father had said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the ledger where he calculated his profits. "He will provide for you. You will do your duty." The word duty had echoed in her mind, tasting of rust and finality. It meant the end of her, the surrender of her body, her will, her very soul, to be owned and used like a piece of property. The thought had finally broken the paralysis of a lifetime of quiet obedience. That night, with a small satchel containing a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and her mother's locket, she had slipped out into the darkness. Now, her flight had brought her here, to the very end of the train. She pushed open the heavy door to the last car, It was not a passenger car, but a half-empty freight car, smelling of hay and old leather. Large doors on either side were slid partially open, letting in a cross breeze that did little to stir the suffocating heat, but offered a roaring, unfiltered view of the desolate world flying past. And in the corner, sitting on an overturned crate, was a man. He was alone, and he seemed to have been carved from the same silence as the desert itself. He was a cowboy. That much was clear from the worn, dust-caked boots and the felt hat pulled low over his eyes. A long, brown duster, the color of the dry earth, covered him from shoulder to ankle, its edges frayed from wind and wear. He was not looking into the car. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his posture utterly still. There was a stillness about him that was different from mere inactivity. It was a settled, profound quiet, as if he had no need for words or movement, as if he were as much a part of the landscape as the distant mesas. He held a tin cup in one hand, but he didn't drink from it. He just held it, his fingers wrapped around its warmth. Eden's heart hammered against her ribs. He was big, his shoulders broad under the heavy coat, and for a moment, the instinct to flee, to turn and run back to the anonymous crowd, seized her, but she stopped. There was nothing threatening in his stillness. It was contained, self-sufficient. He looked like a man who asked for nothing from the world and expected nothing in return. It was this quality, this absolute lack of demand in his posture, that held her rooted to the spot. He was the opposite of Mr. Albright, the opposite of her father. He was an island of quiet in her sea of noise and fear. She heard it then, a sound from the car behind her, a heavy, familiar tread, and a gravelly voice asking the conductor a question. Silas, one of her father's men? A cold dread, sharp and sickening, washed over her. They were on the train. They were looking for her. Panic clawed at her throat. There was nowhere to go. The open doors on either side of the car offered only a suicidal leap into the blur of sand and rock. The door behind her led back to her pursuers. There was only this space, only this man. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, she moved forward. Her worn shoes made no sound on the dusty floorboards. She stopped a few feet from him, a supplicant before a stone idol. He didn't move. He gave no sign that he had even noticed her. She wondered if he was asleep under the brim of his hat. She had to force the words from her throat, a whisper so faint it was nearly lost in the roar of the wind and the clatter of the wheels. Mr. His head turned, just slightly. He didn't raise it, but she could feel his attention shift to her. He still hadn't looked at her, but he was listening. She took another step, her hands twisting the fabric of her dress. "Please," she whispered, the word raw with desperation. "They're looking for me. Can I hide?" The silence that followed was vast. The train rocked, the wind howled, and the man in the corner remained motionless. Eden felt a fresh wave of despair. It had been a foolish, childish impulse. He would tell her to go, or worse, call the conductor himself. She was about to turn away, to accept her fate, when he moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her. He simply raised his left arm, lifting the heavy canvas of his duster. The gesture was an invitation, creating a dark, triangular space between his body and the coat. It was a pocket of shadow, a small cave of safety offered without question or judgment. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes, hot and sharp. She fumbled in the small pocket of her dress, her fingers closing around the few coins she possessed. It was all she had in the world. She held them out. "I can pay you," she said, her voice trembling. He finally looked at her then. He lifted his head, and in the dim light, she saw his face from beneath the shadow of his hat. It was a lean face, tanned by the sun and lined by wind, with a strong jaw shadowed by a day's worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held no judgment, no curiosity, only a calm, steady watchfulness. His gaze flickered from her face to the coins in her outstretched hand, and then back to her face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He didn't want her money. Not knowing what else to do, she let the coins fall back into her pocket and stumbled forward. She knelt on the dusty floor and crawled into the space he had made for her. He lowered his arm, and the duster fell back into place, shrouding her in darkness. The world vanished. The blinding sun, the endless desert, the threat moving through the train, it was all gone. Her new reality was the scent of dust, worn leather, and the faint, clean smell of soap. The rough wool of his trousers pressed against her cheek. She could feel the solid warmth of his leg against her shoulder, the unyielding strength of him. Above her, she could hear the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, and beneath that, the muffled, powerful beat of his heart. It was the sound of life, calm and unwavering. She huddled there, making herself as small as possible. Every muscle tensed. The heavy footsteps and the gravelly voice of Silas grew louder, stopping just outside the door to the freight car. "Anything in there?" Conductor Silas asked. "Just some freight for Mesa Verde and one quiet fella who's been there since sunrise," the conductor's voice replied, bored and tired. "Mind if I take a look?" "Be my guest. Ain't my job to stop you." The door to the car remained open. Eden held her breath, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She could feel the man, Luke, remain perfectly still. Not a muscle twitched. His calm was a shield, and she pressed herself against it, praying it would be enough. She pictured Silas's cruel, rat-like eyes scanning the shadowy corners of the car. He would see the cowboy. Of course, but would he look closer? Would he see the slight bulge in the duster, the edge of her worn skirt peeking out from beneath? An eternity seemed to pass, measured in the frantic thumping of her own heart. Then she heard Silas grunt. "Nah, he'd have put her in one of the crowded cars. Keep going." The footsteps receded, moving on down the length of the train. Eden didn't move. She waited, listening to the fading sounds, until the only things she could hear were the train and the steady beat of the cowboy's heart. A long, shuddering breath escaped her, a sob of relief she couldn't hold back. She felt a slight shift in the man's posture, a release of tension she hadn't even been aware he was holding. He still didn't speak. He didn't ask who she was or what she was running from. He didn't offer comfort or ask for an explanation. He just sat there, a silent, unmovable mountain, and let her hide in his shadow. He had allowed her, a desperate stranger, to touch the edges of his vast, quiet world, and in doing so, had given her the first moment of safety she had felt in days. Curled in the darkness, lulled by the rhythm of his breathing, Eden closed her eyes. For now, it was enough. Time stretched into a thick, syrupy crawl. Huddled in the darkness beneath the cowboy's duster, Eden lost all sense of it. Her world compressed into the rhythmic sway of the train and the steady, living anchor of the man beside her. The heat was immense, a stifling blanket that left her feeling dizzy and weak. But she dared not move. Every muscle in her body ached from the cramped position, a dull throb that was a constant reminder of her precarious safety. She listened to the cadence of his breathing, matching her own to its slow, even pace, finding a strange comfort in the shared rhythm. Gratitude, sharp and overwhelming, warred with a profound confusion. Why had he done it? He knew nothing of her, of the cold transaction she was fleeing, or the men who pursued her. To him, she was just a whisper in the wind, a frightened girl with nothing to offer. Yet, he had offered her sanctuary without a moment's hesitation, shielding her with his own body. He was an enigma, a man made of silence and unexpected kindness, and the mystery of him was as compelling as the safety he provided. Outside, the brutal white light of midday softened, melting into the long golden hues of late afternoon. The shafts of light that pierced the freight car's gloom grew slanted and amber, painting the dusty air in warmer tones, Shadows stretched like grasping fingers across the floor. Eden could feel the subtle shift in the day's temperature through the heavy fabric of the duster, a hint of the cool that would soon descend upon the desert with the setting sun. It was this change, this subtle relaxation in the world around them, that made the return of the threat so jarring. She felt it first in him, a sudden tension, a quiet hardening of the muscles in his leg against her shoulder. His breathing, which had been so steady, hitched for a single, almost imperceptible moment before resuming its calm rhythm. But it was a forced calm now. He had sensed something, heard something. Her own body went rigid, her senses straining, trying to pierce the wall of noise from the train. Then she heard it too, the heavy, determined tread of boots. Coming back. This time there were 2 sets of footsteps. A low murmur of voices followed, too indistinct to make out the words. But the tone was sharp, impatient. Silas, and he had brought someone else. The door to the next car screeched open and slammed shut. They were in the car now. He said he came this way, Silas's gravelly voice said. Much closer now. It was a sound that scraped along Eden's nerves like a rusty file, a slip of a thing in a dark dress. Can't have just vanished. Maybe she jumped, another, colder voice answered. Not her. She ain't got the nerve. She's hiding. Search it all. Every crate, every barrel. Panic, cold and absolute, seized Eden. Her breath caught in her throat. A choked, silent scream. This was it. There was no escape. They would find her. The space that had felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. A coffin. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the feel of a rough hand yanking the duster away, for the triumphant sneer in Silas's voice. But the cowboy, Luke, moved before they could. His action was a lightning strike in the stillness. It was so fast, so sudden, it defied thought. One moment he was a statue of calm, the next he was a blur of decisive motion. His left hand, which had been resting on his knee, shot out and clamped around her upper arm. The grip was not brutal, but it was unyieldingly firm, a band of steel. With his other hand, he flung the duster back. The sudden rush of light and air was a physical blow. Eden gasped, blinking against the sudden brightness and the roaring wind from the open side door. She saw the 2 men, Silas and another, taller figure, turning toward them at the far end of the car. Their face registers of surprise. She saw the world outside, a dizzying, terrifying streak of brown and red earth. Luke was already on his feet, pulling her up with him in a single, fluid motion. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak a word of explanation or warning. His focus was entirely on the open doorway, a gaping mouth that promised either freedom or death. For a horrifying second, Eden resisted, her feet rooted to the floor in sheer terror. Jump! The idea was insane. The ground was a blur, the speed immense. He gave her no choice. His grip tightened, pulling her forward. Now, he said. It was the first word he had spoken to her. His voice was a low, rough baritone, not a command so much as a statement of unavoidable fact. And then they were falling. The world dissolved into a chaotic symphony of sensation. The roar of the wind filled her ears, silencing everything else. The train, their prison, and their only link to the known world, was violently ripped away. She had a fleeting, surreal image of Silas's astonished, angry face shrinking into the distance. Then the ground rushed up to meet them. They hit not with a clean landing, but with a brutal, tumbling impact. Luke had twisted his body in midair, taking the brunt of the fall himself. His shoulders struck the hard-packed earth first, and they rolled. A tangle of limbs and flying dust. The breath was knocked from Eden's lungs in a painful whoosh. Gravel and sharp stones scraped at her hands and face. The world spun violently and then settled into a bruised, aching stillness. For a moment, she could only lie there, gasping for air, her mind a blank slate of shock. The only sound was the fading clatter of the train, growing smaller and smaller down the iron tracks until it was just a whisper, and then nothing. The silence of the desert rushed back in, vast and absolute. "Up! Get up!" The voice was at her ear, urgent and low. A hand was on her back, pushing her. Luke was already crouched, his head low, his eyes scanning the landscape. There was a long, bleeding scrape along his jawline, but he seemed oblivious to it. His gaze was fixed on a deep, shadowed ravine, a jagged scar in the earth about 100 yards away. "They'll stop the train," he said, pulling her to her feet. Her legs felt like jelly, and a sharp pain shot through her ankle. But the adrenaline and the terror were a potent fuel. "We have to get to cover. Run!" And so they ran. It was a clumsy, desperate flight. Eden's thin-soled shoes, made for town sidewalks, were no match for the treacherous terrain. Stones turned under her feet, and the thorny branches of greasewood bushes tore at her skirt and skin. Her lungs burned, and every breath was a searing gasp of hot, dusty air. But she ran, her eyes fixed on the broad, steady back of the man in front of her. He moved with a surprising grace, his long legs eating up the difficult ground. He never looked back to see if she was following. He just knew she was. That simple, unspoken assumption was a powerful bond. In the space of a heartbeat, her life had become irrevocably tied to this silent stranger. Her survival depended entirely on his strength, his knowledge, his will. She had no choice but to trust him. They reached the edge of the ravine and scrambled down the steep, crumbling bank. The air was immediately cooler in the shadows, the sun blocked by the high, rocky walls. They were hidden from the open plains. Luke didn't stop. He pushed deeper, following the winding, dry wash of the arroyo bed. The sand was soft underfoot, making their progress slower but quieter. After another 100 yards, he finally stopped behind a large outcrop of red rock that offered a concealed vantage point of the plains above. Eden collapsed against the cool stone, her chest heaving, her whole body trembling with exhaustion and reaction. Luke, however, showed no signs of fatigue. He was watching the distant train, which had now ground to a screeching halt, a thin black line under the setting sun. He turned from his watch, and his gaze fell on her. He saw her torn dress, the scrapes on her arms, the way she favored her ankle. For a moment, his expression softened, the hard lines of his face easing into something that looked almost like concern. Then, he became a man of action again. Without a word, he set to work. He gathered a small pile of the driest, most brittle brush he could find, pulling a chunk of dead, resinous greasewood from a nearby bank. He arranged it carefully in a small, cleared patch of sand. From a leather pouch on his belt, he took a piece of flint and a steel striker. With a few sharp, efficient strikes, a shower of sparks fell onto the tinder. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards, followed by a small, hungry flame. Eden watched, confused. A fire. It would give away their position immediately. But Luke wasn't building a warming fire. He quickly smothered the flames with green-leafed branches he tore from a hardy bush growing in the shade. A thick, acrid plume of white smoke billowed upwards, a dense column rising straight into the still evening air. He let it pour out for a full minute, a clear and obvious signal. Then, just as quickly, he stamped it out, scattering the ashes and burying the evidence under a layer of sand. He had created a ghost, a false signpost. He pointed back up the ravine, in the opposite direction from where they'd come. "They'll see the smoke," he said, his voice still low and raspy from disuse. "They'll think we went that way. It'll buy us time." He then came to her, kneeling on one knee. He looked at the scrapes on her arm, raw and beaded with blood. He reached into his duster and pulled out a clean, folded bandana. Uncorking his canteen, he poured a small amount of precious water onto the cloth and began to gently, methodically clean the grit from her wounds. His hands, which she had seen strike fire from stone, were surprisingly gentle. The touch was impersonal, practical, and yet it was the most profound act of care she had ever received. As he worked in the growing twilight, she watched his face. She saw the concentration in his clear blue eyes, the grim set of his mouth. She saw the old, faded scar that cut through his left eyebrow, and the newer, raw one on his jaw. And in that quiet moment, as he tended to her hurts in the shelter of the ravine, a deep and certain understanding bloomed within her. His silence wasn't coldness. It wasn't a lack of feeling or a disdain for the world. It was a shield, a fortress built stone by stone around a place that had been breached before. A man didn't learn to move with such quiet purpose, to anticipate danger in the shift of the wind, to react with such thoughtless, protective instinct, unless he had been taught hard lessons by pain. He was not a man who felt nothing. He was a man who had been forced to feel too much, and had chosen silence as his only refuge. He was quiet not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that words were flimsy, untrustworthy things. Actions, a lifted coat, a steadying hand, a desperate leap into the unknown were the only language he trusted. He finished cleaning the last scrape and tied the bandana carefully, if a little awkwardly, around her forearm. His work done. He stood up, his gaze once more sweeping the rim of the canyon, ever watchful. He offered her the canteen. "Drink," he said. Eden took it, her fingers brushing against his. She drank the cool, slightly metallic-tasting water, the first she'd had since that morning. It was life itself. She handed it back to him, and their eyes met for a long moment in the deepening gloom. In his, she saw not a stranger, but a reflection of her own lonely survival. The foundation of trust, laid in the desperate moment in the freight car, had now settled into something solid and real. They were two solitary souls, thrown together by chance and violence, alone in the vast, unforgiving heart of the desert. And for the first time since she had climbed out of her window, Eden did not feel entirely alone. They walked through the night, the desert, which had been a furnace by day, transformed into a vast, cold chamber under a sky littered with stars. The moon rose, a sliver of polished bone, casting a faint, ghostly light that made the landscape of rock and sand seem alien and unknowable. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the whisper of a wind that carried the chill of the high country. Eden's ankle, which had only throbbed before, was now a source of sharp, insistent pain with every step. She did not complain. To speak of it would be to admit weakness, to become a burden. The man beside her, Luke, had saved her life. She would not repay him by slowing them down. She focused on the back of his duster, a dark, moving shape in the gloom, and placed her feet where he had placed his. He seemed to possess a sixth sense for the land, navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were a familiar room in his own house. He led them through dry washes and around thorny thickets, his pace steady and relentless. He never seemed to tire. Several times, when she stumbled on a loose rock, his hand would shoot out, his grip firm on her arm, steadying her before she could fall. He would hold her for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting to feel her balance return, and then release her without a word. Each time, the brief contact was a silent transfer of strength. Hours bled into one another. Eden's exhaustion became a heavy cloak, her thoughts blurring into a single, desperate prayer to keep moving. Just as she felt the last of her strength begin to fray, she saw him stop. He stood on a low rise, a silhouette against the star-dusted horizon, looking down into a wide, shallow valley. Following his gaze, she saw it, a light, a single, tiny pinprick of gold, warm and impossibly welcoming in the immense, cold darkness. It was the light of a lamp in a window. It was a promise of shelter, of an end to this desperate flight. Hope, a feeling so foreign she had almost forgotten its shape, surged through her, bringing with it a fresh wave of tears that she blinked back fiercely. The walk down into the valley was the longest part of the journey. With every step, the light grew, resolving itself into the square of a window in a low, dark structure. Soon, other shapes emerged from the gloom: a long, sturdy-looking barn, a series of fenced corrals, a water trough, and a small, solitary cabin. The place had an air of permanence, of having been wrested from the wilderness and held by sheer force of will. The buildings were made of dark, weather-beaten timber, solid and unyielding, built on stone foundations that seemed to grow from the earth itself. It was not a pretty place. It was a place built to endure. As they drew closer, a dog began to bark from inside the cabin, a deep, booming sound that echoed in the quiet valley. The light in the window moved, and the cabin door creaked open, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow light onto the hard-packed earth. "Luke," a small voice called out, laced with sleep. Luke raised a hand. "It's me, Tom. Go on back to bed." The door opened wider, and a small, dark-haired boy of no more than 7 or 8 years stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. He was holding the big hound by its collar, the dog's tail now wagging furiously. The boy was swallowed by a long nightshirt that pooled at his bare feet. His gaze fell on Eden, and his eyes widened with a child's unfiltered curiosity. Luke stepped onto the porch, his boots thudding heavily on the wood. He placed a hand on the boy's head, his large, rough fingers surprisingly gentle as they ruffled his hair. "This is Eden," he said, his voice softer than she had yet heard it. "She'll be staying with us for a spell." The boy, Tom, just stared, his thumb finding its way into his mouth. Luke didn't press him. He gently nudged the boy back inside and then turned, waiting for Eden to climb the 2 steps to the porch. Her ankles screamed in protest, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. Luke saw her falter. Without a word, he stepped down, slid a strong arm around her waist, and half lifted her onto the porch and through the door. He set her down just inside. The warmth of the cabin enveloped her, a comforting blanket scented with wood smoke, coffee, and the clean smell of pine. The room was simple, spare, and utterly masculine. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire banking down to glowing orange embers. A sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A dry sink with a bucket of water and a wash basin stood against another wall. Shelves held a few tin plates, cups, and a small, orderly stack of books. It was a space stripped down to its essentials, a room for living, not for show. Luke nudged the door shut with his foot, the latch clicking into place with a sound of finality. The sound seemed to lock the vast, dangerous world outside. He gestured toward a closed door at the back of the cabin. "That's your room. There's water in the pitcher." He then walked over to the boy, who was now leaning sleepily against his leg. He lifted Tom into his arms with an ease that spoke of long practice. "I rescued him from a bad spot a few years back," he said quietly, by way of explanation, his eyes on the boy's face. Tom was already half asleep again, his head nestled into the curve of Luke's neck. With another nod toward Eden, he carried the boy into the other room, his own bedroom, and gently closed the door. Left alone, Eden stood for a long moment, swaying with exhaustion. The silence in the cabin was different from the silence of the desert. It was a warm, breathing silence, filled with the soft hiss of the embers and the gentle sigh of the wind outside the sturdy walls. This was his home, a place of quiet strength, a refuge he had carved out for himself and a small boy. And now, for her, she limped to the room he had indicated and pushed open the door. It was small and even more spare than the main room. A simple rope bed with a thick wool blanket, a small wooden crate for a bedside table, and a single, high window that looked out into the darkness. A pitcher of water and a basin sat on a small washstand. It was more than she could have dreamed of. She poured some of the cool water into the basin and washed her face and hands, scrubbing away the grime of the journey. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging on the wall. A stranger stared back at her, a pale, wide-eyed girl with dirt on her cheek and a wild, haunted look in her eyes. She looked like a hunted thing, but she had survived. She had run, and she had been saved. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the ropes groaning under her weight. She didn't bother to take off her dress, merely unlacing her boots and letting them fall to the floor. She pulled the heavy blanket over herself and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first true sleep she had known in what felt like a lifetime. She awoke to the smell of frying bacon and the sound of a child's laughter. Sunlight, bright and clear, streamed through the small window. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was. Then it all came rushing back: the train, the jump, the long walk through the darkness. She sat up, her body aching with a chorus of new pains. She dressed her sore ankle with a strip of cloth torn from her petticoat and limped out into the main room. Tom was sitting at the table, kicking his bare feet, while Luke stood at the hearth, turning strips of bacon in a cast-iron skillet. The big hound, whose name she'd learned was Buck, thumped his tail against the floorboards in greeting. Luke glanced over his shoulder. He didn't smile, but the harsh lines around his eyes seemed to have softened in the morning light. "There's coffee," he said, nodding toward the pot warming by the fire. It was the most normal sentence she had heard in days. She poured herself a cup of the strong black coffee and sat at the table opposite Tom, who watched her with solemn, curious eyes. Luke served them bacon and day-old biscuits, and the three of them ate in a comfortable silence. It was a fragile picture of a family, one that felt both impossibly strange and deeply yearned for. After they ate, Luke stood up, pulling on his hat. "I've got fences to mend. Tom will show you where things are." And with that, he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving Eden alone with the boy in the quiet house. An uncertain silence fell. Eden didn't know what was expected of her. She was a guest, a refugee, but she could not bear to be idle. To be useless was to be a burden, and a burden could be discarded. She looked around the cabin. It was clean in a functional way, but it lacked a woman's touch. Dust lay in the corners. The shelves were disorganized, and a pile of mending sat in a basket by the fire. She started with the dishes. Heating water over the fire, she scrubbed the tin plates and cups until they shone. Tom watched her, his initial shyness slowly giving way to curiosity. She found a broom and swept the floor, the rhythmic whisking sound a comforting domestic noise. She wiped down the table, organized the tins of flour and sugar on the shelves, and took stock of their meager supplies. As she worked, something inside her began to unknot. The constant, thrumming fear that had been her companion for so long began to recede, replaced by the simple, satisfying rhythm of work. Her hands, which had been clenched in fear, were now busy with purpose. She was not running. She was not hiding. She was living. She was making a small corner of the world clean and orderly. She was contributing. In the afternoon, she took the mending basket out onto the porch, sitting in a worn rocking chair that seemed to have been molded to the shape of its owner. The sun was warm on her face, and a gentle breeze stirred the air. The valley was peaceful, a self-contained world of golden grass and scattered oak trees, ringed by the protective embrace of the low mountains. She could see Luke in the distance, a solitary figure moving along a fence line, his movements economical and sure. Tom, emboldened by her quiet presence, brought out a handful of carved wooden animals and began to play at her feet. She stitched a patch onto the knee of his trousers, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric. She was restoring something, making it whole again. It felt like she was doing the same for herself. She felt a flicker of peace, a feeling so delicate she was almost afraid to breathe on it, for fear it would vanish. This place, this simple, sturdy cabin, was an island of safety in a violent world. But she couldn't let herself forget the world outside. Silas and the other men were still out there. Her father was out there, the life that had been planned for her, a life of subjugation and duty. was still waiting. This feeling of safety, she knew, was borrowed. It belonged to Luke. He had offered it to her without question. But for how long she was a stranger who had stumbled into his solitary life, a complication he hadn't asked for. When Luke returned at dusk, weary and streaked with dust, he stopped on the porch, his gaze taking in the scene. He saw Tom playing. He saw the neat stack of mended clothes beside her, and he saw her, sitting in his chair as if she belonged there. He didn't say anything. He just stood there for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before stepping inside. That evening, as she lay in the small bed, listening to the gentle sounds of the sleeping house, Eden felt the precariousness of her new reality. She was safe, for now. She had a roof over her head and food in her belly. She had been shown a kindness that asked for nothing in return. But it was a fragile peace. It was a shelter built in the path of a storm, and she did not know if its walls were strong enough to hold. She felt safe, but she had not yet dared to believe in it. The days settled into a quiet rhythm, as predictable and soothing as the rise and fall of the sun. Luke would be gone before dawn. The soft thud of his boots on the floorboards and the quiet click of the cabin door the only signs of his departure. Eden would rise in the gray twilight, coaxing the embers in the hearth back to life. She would make coffee and biscuits, and by the time Tom padded out of his room, sleepy-eyed and silent, the cabin would be filled with the warm, comforting smells of a home waking up. They established a routine that needed no words. While Luke was out working the vast, lonely stretches of his land, Eden and Tom became the quiet keepers of the homestead. She taught him how to knead dough, his small hands inexpertly mimicking her own, leaving smudges of flour on his nose that made her smile. He showed her the best places to find wild onions by the creek, and which of the chickens was the most likely to peck her fingers. She mended their clothes, tended a small, struggling vegetable garden behind the cabin, and slowly, methodically, brought a sense of gentle order to the Spartan space. The work was a balm to her soul. It was simple, honest labor that produced tangible results: a clean floor, a full stew pot, a neatly patched shirt. Each completed task was a small victory against the chaos that had chased her into the desert. In the silence of the valley, surrounded by the steady presence of the mountains, the frantic, terrified girl who had jumped from a train began to recede, and a quieter, more resilient version of herself began to emerge. She learned the landscape of Luke's silence. It was not one thing, but many. There was the focused silence of his work, when his entire being was bent toward a task: mending a harness, sharpening an axe, his hands moving with an unhurried, expert grace. There was the watchful silence of the evenings, when he sat on the porch, his eyes scanning the horizon, a man constantly gauging the temper of the wilderness he called home. And then there was the softer silence he reserved for Tom, when he would listen to the boy's rambling stories about his day with a quiet, unwavering attention that was more affirming than any praise. Eden found herself fitting into these silences, learning their language. She learned to sit with him on the porch as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, neither of them speaking, yet sharing the profound peace of the day's end. She learned that a slight nod from him as he ate the meal she had prepared was the highest form of compliment. She discovered that if she left a cup of hot coffee on the railing, he would find it, and later, the empty cup would be sitting clean and dry by the sink. Their communication became a series of small, quiet gestures, a language of actions that spoke of respect, care, and a growing, mutual reliance. But her past remained a locked room inside her. The peace she felt was real, but it was built on a foundation of unspoken truths. She was living in this man's home, under his protection, and he knew nothing of the reason she had come to be there. The weight of that secret was a constant, low hum beneath the quiet surface of her days. The moment it broke came on an evening like any other. A storm had threatened all afternoon, the sky bruised and heavy, but it had passed without breaking, leaving the air clean and cool. Dinner was over, a simple meal of rabbit stew and fresh bread. Tom, weary from a day of adventure, had fallen asleep early. Luke was cleaning a rifle at the table, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism a precise, rhythmic sound in the quiet cabin. Eden was at the dry sink, her hands submerged in a basin of hot, soapy water, washing the few dishes from their meal. The domestic tranquility of the scene, the warm lamplight, the sleeping child, the man quietly tending his tools was so starkly different from the life she had fled that it created an ache in her chest, a life of quiet purpose. It was all she had ever wanted, and it was what had been stolen from her. She stopped washing, her hands still in the water, her gaze fixed on nothing. Luke must have sensed the change in her, the sudden stillness. The rhythmic cleaning of the rifle ceased. She felt his eyes on her, but he did not speak. He simply waited. The words came out in a voice she barely recognized as her own, a low, unsteady whisper. "My father," she began, her eyes tracing the grain of the wooden wall. "He's a merchant. He values things by what they will fetch, what they are worth in coin." She paused, swallowing hard against the lump in her throat. "I was a debt he needed to clear. He made a contract." She could feel Luke's attention, absolute and focused, a physical weight in the room. She risked a glance at him. He had not moved. His hands were still on the rifle, but his gaze was fixed on her, his blue eyes clear and steady in the lamplight. There was no pity in them, only a profound, silent listening. That quiet attention gave her the strength to continue. "The man he chose, Mr. Albright, he was wealthy. He saw me once in my father's store. I was another item in the inventory. My father was pleased with the price." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. "They came to the house to finalize the arrangement. They talked about me as if I wasn't there, about my health, my temperament, as if I were a horse to be bought." She finally turned to face him, the dishcloth dripping unheeded onto the floor. "I was not a daughter to him. I was a commodity. When I refused, he locked me in my room. He said I would learn my duty. So I ran. That man on the train, Silas, he works for my father. He was coming to take me back." She finished, her story laid bare in the quiet room. She felt empty, scoured out. She expected questions, or judgment, or perhaps the awkward, clumsy words of comfort men sometimes offered. She expected him to say something, anything. Luke did not speak. He slowly, deliberately, set the rifle aside. He stood up from the table and walked the few steps to the sink where she stood trembling. He took the wet dishcloth from her nerveless fingers and dropped it back in the basin. Then, he picked up a dry linen towel from the hook on the wall, took a clean, wet plate from the rack, and began to dry. He stood beside her, his presence a solid, unwavering wall. She washed, and he dried. The only sounds were the soft splash of water and the gentle clink of tin plates being stacked. He did not look at her. His focus was on the simple task at hand. His large, calloused hands, hands that could tame a horse or fire a rifle, moved with a surprising gentleness, carefully wiping every drop of water from a cup, his knuckles brushing against hers in the small space. In his silence, she heard everything she needed to hear. She heard understanding that went deeper than words. She heard acceptance, free of judgment. She heard solidarity. He wasn't offering to fight her battles or save her from her past. He was simply standing with her, in the middle of it, sharing the weight of it by sharing a simple, common task. His silent presence was an anchor, and she felt the last of the terrified trembling inside her finally, truly, begin to still. They finished the dishes without a single word passing between them. When the last plate was dried and stacked, he simply nodded, picked up his rifle, and went to sit on the porch, resuming his silent evening vigil. But something had changed, profoundly. The space between them was no longer filled with questions, but with a shared, unspoken knowledge. The next day, as she was gathering herbs from the creek bed, she saw a single, defiant wildflower. It was a tiny, bell-shaped blossom of the deepest, purest blue, growing from a crack in a sun-baked rock. It was a small, resilient spot of beauty in the harsh, unforgiving landscape. It reminded her of the hope that was beginning, tentatively, to grow in her own heart. She picked it carefully and carried it back to the cabin, not knowing what else to do with it, with the feeling it represented. She laid it on the porch railing, right next to the front door, a small, anonymous offering. It was a thank you, a gesture, a question. Luke came in for dinner that evening and gave no sign that he had even seen it. Eden's heart sank just a little. It had been a foolish, childish gesture. That night, she awoke thirsty. The house was pitch black and silent, save for the soft breathing of Tom in the next room. She crept out to the main room, feeling her way toward the water bucket. A sliver of light shone from under Luke's door. He was still awake. As she passed, she saw the door was slightly ajar. Curiosity, quiet and insistent, made her pause. She peeked through the narrow opening. Luke was sitting at his small writing desk, a single oil lamp casting a pool of golden light around him. He was bent over a thick, leather-bound book, an old ledger or a journal. She couldn't tell, and in his hands, he held the small, blue wildflower. She watched, breathless, as he carefully opened the book to a page near the back, with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible for hands so large and scarred. He laid the flower flat on the page. He took a spare sheet of paper, placed it over the blossom, and slowly, gently, closed the heavy book, pressing the flower between its pages. He had seen her offering. He had understood it, and he had taken it, this small, fragile symbol of her hope, and he was preserving it. He was tucking it away within the pages of his own private world, keeping it safe. Eden backed away from the door, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She fled back to her room, not with water, but with a feeling of profound and certain peace. Nothing had been said, but in the language of quiet things, a promise had been made and accepted. The fierce, white heat of summer bled slowly into the softer gold of autumn. The sun lost its brutal edge, casting long, gentle shadows across the valley in the mornings and evenings. The air grew crisp, carrying the dry, sweet scent of curing grass and distant wood smoke. The days, though still warm, were now bracketed by a chill that whispered of the coming winter, a reminder that the earth was turning. And that time, even in this isolated valley, did not stand still. With the changing season came a change in the rhythm of their lives, a settling in. The frantic edge of survival that had defined their first days together softened into a steady, shared purpose. They were preparing for the cold, fortifying their small island of a home against the siege of winter. This preparation became a silent conversation, a daily exchange written in the language of work, a dialogue spoken not by mouths, but by hands. Their affection grew in the space between actions. It was not a thing of grand pronouncements or sudden revelations. It was a quiet, sturdy plant growing in the soil of their daily lives, nurtured by small, consistent acts of care. It was a language they both understood instinctively, for they were two people who had learned that words could be weapons or lies. While the work of a person's hands was an irrefutable truth, Eden discovered the poetry in Luke's labor. She would watch him from the cabin porch as he worked on the corrals, his movements spare and efficient. There was no wasted motion. The swing of his hammer was a clean, powerful arc that drove a nail home in 3 resounding strikes. The way he tested a newly set fence post, placing his full weight against it, was a statement of his desire for permanence, for security. His hands, calloused and scarred, were instruments of creation and order. They built, they repaired, they made things strong. They were the hands of a man who fought against the entropy of the wilderness, creating a small, safe space through sheer will and effort. He, in turn, observed the quiet transformation she wrought upon his home. He would return at dusk to find the cabin not just tidy, but welcoming. A jar of late-blooming wild asters might sit on the table. A loaf of bread, impossibly fragrant, would be cooling on a rack by the hearth. He noticed the way she had stitched a new, softer curtain for the window out of an old flour sack, a small touch that gentled the harsh afternoon light. He never commented on these changes, but his eyes would take in every detail. His approval was in the slight relaxation of his shoulders as he stepped through the door, in the way he would sit at the table she had set and seem, for a moment, to let the weariness of the day fall away from him. One afternoon, Eden took it upon herself to begin splitting the wood Luke had hauled and stacked by the cabin. The pile was immense, a testament to the severity of the winters he expected. The axe was heavy, and her first few swings were clumsy, but she was driven by a deep need to contribute, to pull her own weight and more. Her hands blistered, and her back ached, but the rhythmic work was satisfying. She worked for an hour until the sun beat down on her, and she retreated to the cool of the porch for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her arm. When she returned to the woodpile a few minutes later, she found the axe was gone. In its place, leaning against the chopping block, was a smaller, lighter hand axe, its edge sharpened to a razor's gleam. Beside it, a dipper of cool, fresh water from the well sat waiting for her. Luke was nowhere in sight. He was likely a mile away, mending the northern fence line, but he had been there. He had seen her struggle, and without a word, without making her feel weak or incapable, he had made her work easier. He had anticipated her thirst. He had said, in his silent way, "I see you. I am here for you." Their lives became a series of these quiet, interlocking gestures. On a chilly afternoon, Eden sat on the porch steps, sewing. She was making a new shirt for Tom, fashioning it from one of Luke's old chambray work shirts, a garment faded to the soft blue of a hazy sky and worn thin at the elbows. Her hands moved with a newfound confidence, the needle dipping and rising, her stitches small and even. It was an act of quiet devotion, transforming a man's worn-out possession into a child's new treasure, stitching the three of them together with a single, sturdy thread. As she worked, the air was filled with the sounds of Luke's own labor. The back door of the cabin had a loose hinge that caused it to sag and stick. He had decided, that afternoon, to fix it. The rhythmic rasp of his wood plane shaving the door's edge, the sharp tap-tap-tap of his hammer setting a new pin in the hinge, these sounds were the backdrop to her sewing. They were working on different tasks, at different ends of the same small house, but their efforts were aligned. She was mending the fabric of their little family. He was strengthening the structure of their home. Without exchanging a single word, they were engaged in the same project, building a life together, nail by nail, stitch by stitch. One evening, he came in late, his shadow long in the doorway. He was holding his left hand stiffly at his side. As he stepped into the lamplight, she saw a long, ugly gash across his palm, dark with blood. "A wire fence," he said, his voice tight with pain. It was more of an explanation than he usually offered. "Sit down," Eden said, her own voice firm, leaving no room for argument. She pushed a chair toward the table and hurried to fetch the basin and her small box of herbs and clean bandages. He sat, and for the first time, he seemed to let his guard down completely, a weary sigh escaping him. He laid his injured hand on the table, palm up, an offering of trust. Eden gently took his hand in hers. It was the first time she had truly held it, and she was struck by the contrast of its roughness against her own skin. It was a landscape of a life lived outdoors of calluses, old scars, and ingrained dust that would never wash away. Yet, beneath the hardened surface, she could feel the steady, living warmth of him. She worked carefully, her fingers deft as she cleaned the wound with warm water and a tincture of yarrow to stop the bleeding. He watched her, his expression unreadable, but he did not flinch or pull away. He simply sat, allowing her to care for him, ceding control in a way that felt more intimate than any embrace. Her touch was gentle, reverent. She was not just tending a wound, she was tending to him. The man, the silent protector who rarely allowed any sign of weakness. When she was done, she wrapped his hand in clean linen, her final knot firm and secure. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. She only nodded, her heart too full to speak. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand in hers, a connection that lingered long after she let go. The evenings by the fire grew longer as the nights deepened. After Tom was asleep, a comfortable quiet would settle over the main room. Eden would mend or knit, the soft click of her needles a soothing counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. Luke would often sit with the old, battered book she had seen him with before. One night, instead of just reading to himself, he cleared his throat softly. In the quiet room, his voice, when he finally used it for more than a single word, was a revelation deep, resonant, and unexpectedly gentle. He began to read, not looking at her, but directing the words toward the flickering flames. "Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments." He read, his voice steady. "Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove." He read the entire sonnet, his diction careful, as if the words themselves were precious things. When he finished, the silence that returned was different, charged with the weight and beauty of the poetry. He had not said the words were for her, but in the small, fire-lit cabin, they hung in the air, a perfect articulation of the unspoken truth between them. Love, for them, was not a declaration. It was this, the unwavering presence, the steady hand, the quiet anticipation of a need. It was a thing that did not alter, that would not be removed by threat or fear. He closed the book and placed it on the mantel. He met her gaze across the room, and, for a long moment, the quiet between them was more eloquent than any conversation. In his eyes, she saw an acknowledgement, a confirmation of everything she felt. She looked down at her own hands, resting in her lap. They were no longer the pale, soft hands of a merchant's daughter. They were chapped from lye soap and water, with a new callus forming on her thumb from the needle, a small blister from the axe handle. They were the hands of a woman who worked, who provided, who cared. They were hands that had found their purpose. Love, she realized, had its own vocabulary. It was not spoken in vows or whispered promises. For people like them, solitary souls scarred by the world, it was communicated in the steadfast language of hands. It was in the cup of water left on a woodpile, in the careful stitches of a mended shirt, in the firm, sure grip that steadied a stumble, in the gentle cleaning of a wound. It was in every repaired fence, every loaf of bread, every shared silence by the fire. Each action was a single, quiet sentence in an ongoing conversation, and every sentence meant the same thing. "I am here. I will not leave. I am here. For you." The peace of the valley was a fragile, precious thing, and Eden had come to guard it as fiercely as she guarded her own heart. The days had fallen into a rhythm so natural it felt as if she had lived this life forever. The quiet mornings, the honest work under a wide, clean sky, the shared, silent evenings, it was a life built of small, sturdy moments that, together, had created a fortress against her past. She had begun to believe the fortress was impenetrable. The day the storm broke was beautiful. The air was so clear the distant mountains seemed close enough to touch, their granite faces etched in sharp relief against a sky of impossible blue. A gentle breeze, cool with the promise of winter, rustled the dry leaves of the cottonwoods by the creek. Eden was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and an old oak tree. The clean, damp scent of lye soap and sun-dried linen, a simple, profound pleasure. Tom was nearby, engrossed in building a complicated fort out of twigs and stones for his collection of carved animals. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind, the cheerful chirping of crickets, and the rhythmic thud of an axe from the woods where Luke was clearing fallen timber. It was Eden who saw it first. a faint disturbance on the northern horizon, where the valley opened up to the plains. At first, she thought it was a dust devil, a common enough sight, but it did not dance or dissipate. It was a low, purposeful cloud of dust, growing steadily, resolving itself into the shape of riders. 3 of them. A cold fist of dread clenched in her stomach. Strangers were a rarity in this isolated place. Luke had mentioned a few distant neighbors, but they never came unannounced. These riders moved with a confidence that was not friendly. She pulled the last clothespin from her mouth, her eyes fixed on the approaching dust cloud. Tom, oblivious, continued his game. The steady, comforting sound of Luke's axe suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, watchful. He had seen them too. A moment later, he emerged from the tree line, moving not with his usual unhurried stride, but with a long, ground-eating pace. He carried the axe in one hand, its blade gleaming in the sun. He didn't look at her, his gaze locked on the riders, but his voice was a low, urgent command that cut through the peaceful air. "Eden, get Tom, inside, now." The quiet authority in his tone galvanized her. She scooped Tom into her arms, ignoring his cry of protest at the interruption of his game. "Hush now," she murmured, her lips against his hair, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. She carried him into the cabin, Buck the hound whining nervously at her heels. She set Tom down and turned back to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Luke was on the porch now, standing with his feet planted slightly apart, the axe held loosely at his side. He was no longer the quiet rancher. He was a guardian at the gate, a man made of stone and steel, his stillness more menacing than any threat. The riders drew closer, slowing their horses to a walk as they entered the cleared area around the cabin. Eden's blood ran cold as she recognized the man in the lead. It was Silas. His rat-like face was set in a triumphant sneer. Beside him were 2 other men, brutish and hard-faced, their hands resting on the pistols holstered at their hips. "Well now," Silas called out, his voice oily and loud in the quiet valley. "Look what we have here, a cozy little homestead. We were just passing through. Heard you might have taken in a stray." His eyes flickered past Luke and fixed on the cabin door, a cruel glint in them. He knew she was there. Luke did not move. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously quiet. "You've got the wrong place. Keep riding." Silas chuckled. A dry, rasping sound. "I don't think so. We've got business with a girl, a piece of property belonging to Mr. Albright. The law is on our side." He swung down from his horse, the other 2 men following his lead, fanning out to flank him. "She's not property," Luke said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "And you're not the law. This is my land. Turn around and leave." "We can do this easy or we can do this hard," Silas said, taking a step forward. "Mr. Albright is a patient man, but his patience has run out. He wants what he paid for." Eden, watching through a narrow crack in the door, felt a wave of nausea. To them, she was a thing, a parcel to be collected, and this good, quiet man was standing between them and their prize. She saw the subtle shift in Luke's shoulders, the way his knuckles whitened around the handle of the axe. "There's only one way this is going to happen," Luke said softly, "and that's with you leaving." The world exploded into violence. Silas gave a sharp nod, and the 2 men beside him surged forward. They had expected him to be armed with a gun, and the axe, a tool of woodcutting, seemed to them a lesser threat. They were wrong. Luke met their rush not by backing away, but by stepping into it. He moved with a speed that was shocking. The axe no longer a tool, but a seamless extension of his arm. He didn't use the blade. He swung the heavy, flat back of the axe head in a brutal arc, catching the first man squarely in the ribs. The man grunted, a sickening crack echoing in the air, and staggered back, clutching his side. The second man was on him, a big burly figure with a knife in his hand. Luke sidestepped the wild slash, brought the axe handle up to block the man's arm, and drove his fist into the man's throat. The man gagged, his eyes wide with shock, and stumbled away, clawing at his neck. But it was 3 against 1, as Luke dealt with the second man. Silas, who had circled around, swung a heavy club-like piece of wood he'd pulled from the woodpile. Luke turned, but not fast enough. The club caught him on the side of the head with a sickening thud. Eden screamed, a raw, involuntary sound torn from her throat. Luke staggered, his eyes glazing over. He shook his head, trying to clear it, but his strength was failing. The first man, recovering, charged again, tackling him around the waist. They went down in a cloud of dust, a thrashing, desperate tangle of limbs. The second man, his breath rasping, joined the fray, his boots rising and falling, kicking at Luke's prone body. "Get him tied up," Silas yelled, tossing a rope to the man with a knife. Eden's world had narrowed to that single, horrific scene. The protector, the unbreachable wall, was being overwhelmed, beaten. She saw them roll him over, his face bloody, his body limp. A wave of cold, absolute terror washed over her, so profound it almost paralyzed her. But then she heard another sound, a small, frightened whimper from behind her. Tom. He was huddled by the hearth, his face buried in Buck's shaggy fur, his small body shaking with sobs. In that instant, something inside Eden shifted. The terror did not vanish, but it was consumed by a fire so hot and fierce it burned away every trace of fear. It was the primal, unthinking rage of a mother protecting her young. This was her home, that was her child, and that was her man, lying broken in the dirt. Her eyes flew to the wall above the mantelpiece, to the long rifle that rested there on 2 wooden pegs, Luke's rifle. She had seen him clean it, but she had never touched it. The thought of it, of what it was for, had always frightened her. Not anymore. She scrambled onto a stool, her hands trembling as she lifted the heavy weapon down. It was surprisingly heavy, cold and alien in her grasp. She fumbled with the loading mechanism, her mind a frantic blank. How did it work? She'd seen him do it 1,000 times. Powder, patch, ball, ram it home. Her fingers were clumsy, but the muscle memory of her observation took over. She managed to load a single, desperate charge. The door. They would be at the door next. She dragged the heavy dining table, its legs scraping loudly on the floorboards, and wedged it against the door. Then she pulled Tom behind the overturned table, creating a small, makeshift barricade. "Stay down," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Don't you move." A shadow fell across the window. Silas's sneering face appeared. Cupped by his hands as he peered inside, he saw her. He saw the rifle. His eyes widened in surprise, and then narrowed in contempt. "Put that down, girl," he snarled through the glass. "You don't have the stomach for it." He disappeared from the window, and a moment later, a heavy shoulder slammed against the door. The wood groaned, the barricade shuddered. Another slam, and a crack appeared in the door. Eden's heart was a wild drum. She rested the long, heavy barrel of the rifle on the back of the table, trying to aim at the splintering door, but her hands were shaking too violently. She couldn't hold it steady. Tom was crying, a high, thin sound of terror. "I can't do this," she thought, a wave of despair washing over her. "I can't." It was then that a new sound cut through the chaos, a deafening, thunderous boom that came not from the front of the cabin, but from the side, near the barn. Drop it now, you sons of bitches!" The voice was old, cracked, but filled with a gravelly fury. Eden dared to peek over the table and through the window. Standing at the corner of the barn was a figure she barely recognized. It was Raoul, an old ranch hand who Luke hired on for a few weeks every autumn to help with the roundup. He was a stooped, wiry man with a face like a dried apple, who rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time. Now, he was standing tall, A massive double-barreled shotgun held steady in his gnarled hands. Its twin muzzles pointed directly at the backs of Silas's men. The two goons who had been trying to break down the door froze, their hands raised in surprise. Silas spun around, his face a mask of fury. "An old man, you think you can stop us?" Silas sneered, his hand dropping toward his pistol. Raoul did not hesitate. The shotgun boomed again, the sound a physical blow. He hadn't aimed at Silas, but at the ground just in front of him. Dirt and gravel exploded, peppering Silas's boots and legs. "Next one's for your gut," Raoul rasped. The distraction was all Eden needed. The two men by the door were focused on Raoul. Silas was momentarily stunned. Her shaking stopped. A cold, clear calm descended upon her. She saw not a man, but a threat to Tom, a threat to Luke. She steadied the rifle barrel, looked down the long sight, and centered it on the shoulder of the man closest to the door. She didn't think. She didn't feel. She pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder like a live thing, slamming her back against the wall. The explosion was deafening in the enclosed space, and the room filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Outside, the man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and shock. He staggered back from the door, clutching his shoulder, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. A stunned silence fell. The other man stared at his wounded companion, then at the cabin door, then at the old man with the shotgun. The fight was gone from him. Silas looked at Luke's unconscious form, at the bloodied man, at Raoul's unwavering shotgun, and finally, at the cabin, where a girl he had dismissed as a helpless piece of property had just shot one of his men. He cursed, a low, vicious sound. "This ain't over," he spat. He grabbed the reins of his horse and hauled himself into the saddle. The uninjured man half dragged, half pushed his wounded companion onto his horse and scrambled onto his own. They dug their heels in, galloping away. Their retreat as chaotic and panicked as their attack had been arrogant. The thunder of their hooves faded, and a profound silence descended on the valley once more. It was a silence that rang with the echoes of violence. Eden didn't move for a long moment. The heavy rifle slid from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. The sound broke the spell. She scrambled over the table and fumbled with the barricade, her hands shaking so badly she could barely lift the latch. She threw the door open and ran out onto the porch. Raoul was already kneeling beside Luke, his shotgun laid carefully on the ground. Eden fell to her knees on the other side of him. His face was a mess of blood and bruises. His eyes were closed, and he was terrifyingly still. But as she laid a trembling hand on his chest, she felt it, a faint, shallow, but steady rise and fall. He was breathing. He was alive. She looked from Luke's unconscious face to the rifle lying on the cabin floor, and then down at her own hands. They were trembling, but they were steady. They were the hands that had loaded a gun. They were the hands that had pulled a trigger. She was no longer the girl who ran. She was the woman who had stood her ground. She had done it for Tom. She had done it for this small, quiet life they had built. She had done it for the unconscious man at her feet. She had stood up for the ones she loved. The chaotic aftermath of the attack gave way to a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. With Raoul's steadying help, Eden managed to get Luke inside and onto his bed. The old ranch hand, his face a grim mask of concern, examined the wound on Luke's head with a practiced eye. "It's the swelling I worry about," Raoul said, his voice a low rumble. "Head wounds are a tricky business. We just have to keep him quiet. And wait." Raoul, in his quiet, capable way, took over the running of the ranch. He mucked out the stalls, checked the fences, and ensured the rhythm of the homestead's life, however wounded, continued. He was the guardian of the world outside the cabin door, but inside, in the dim, quiet sick room, Eden became the guardian of its heart. Luke did not wake. He lay in a deep, unnerving stillness, lost somewhere in the gray country between life and death. The vibrant, watchful man she knew was gone, replaced by a still, silent effigy. The bruises on his face were a stark, painful map of the violence he had endured for her. His breathing was shallow, a faint, fragile thread connecting him to the world. In that quiet room, Eden's world shrank to the size of his bed. The terror and adrenaline of the fight receded, replaced by a fierce, unwavering purpose. The girl who had fled from duty now found herself bound by a duty that was not an imposition, but a choice, a calling. She was no longer a refugee seeking shelter. She was a woman defending her home. The days and nights blurred into a seamless cycle of vigil and care. Time was measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of his breathing, by the tasks that needed doing. Every morning, she would bathe his face with a cloth dipped in cool water, gently cleaning the dried blood from the cut on his jaw, her touch as light as a prayer. She learned the geography of his face, the lines of care and sorrow etched around his eyes, the stubborn set of his jaw, even in unconsciousness. Raoul had shown her how to make a thin, nourishing broth from bone and wild herbs. 4 times a day, she would sit by the bed, a small bowl in her hands, and perform the painstaking ritual of trying to feed him. She would dip the tip of a spoon in the warm liquid and touch it to his lips, hoping a few drops might find their way down his throat. Most of it trickled away, but she was patient. Each drop she managed to get past his lips felt like a monumental victory, a small battle won in the larger war for his life. She moved a rocking chair beside his bed, and it became her post. She rarely slept, and when she did, it was in short, fitful bursts, her head resting on the edge of his mattress, her hand often resting lightly on his arm, as if she could keep him tethered to the world through her touch alone. She would wake with a start at every shift in his breathing, every soft murmur in his sleep. In the long, quiet hours, she watched him, her gaze tracing the strong lines of his body under the simple wool blanket, a body that had been her shield and was now so heartbreakingly vulnerable. Tom was a small, silent ghost in the quiet house. The violence had terrified him, and he clung to Eden's skirts, his large, dark eyes full of a fear he could not articulate. She would hold him, her own heart aching, and murmur reassurances she did not feel. "He's strong. Tom," she would say, stroking his hair, "Luke is the strongest man in the world. He's just resting." She would bring Tom into the sick room for short periods, letting him sit quietly at the foot of the bed. It was important, she felt, for the boy to see that Luke was still there, that he had not been abandoned. It was just as important for Luke, she believed, to have the presence of the child he loved nearby. She hoped that somewhere, deep inside the stillness, he could feel their presence, a small, warm anchor in the dark sea where he drifted. After a few days, the silence in the room began to feel oppressive, a heavy shroud. She needed to fill it, to fight against it, so she began to read to him. At first, she read from the worn Bible on the mantelpiece, her voice soft and even as she read the Psalms, the ancient words of comfort and faith a balm to her own frayed spirit. "So are you to my thoughts as food to life, or as sweet seasoned showers are to the ground." She read poem after poem, her voice filling the quiet room. She read about love and loss, about beauty and time. She spoke the words into the stillness, hoping they might be a thread she could cast to him, a path for him to follow back. It became a daily ritual, her voice a constant, gentle presence in the room, a testament to her unwavering belief that he would return.